This morning I'd like to close the series on Habakkuk. If ever you have felt downhearted and discouraged, these three passages, or rather three chapters in the book of Habakkuk, is really a phenomenal account of a very difficult time in the life of the prophet. I'd like to also welcome Caleb, Zilka, and Laura back from Oman. They traveled overnight. I know Caleb is also struggling with some flu. I know Laura's struggled as well, but they are doing well, and they're with Zilka's family in the north of the country. So we pray that God will bless you and welcome home. In chapter 1 of the book of Habakkuk, we find that Habakkuk, very different from the other prophets, goes and has a discussion with God. It's one of those passages which is very different from the other prophets, because the other prophets all speak to Israel. But Habakkuk speaks to God, and he says, look, there's a problem here. I live in an environment where people are sinning. There's rampant sin, there's rampant corruption. And he almost asks God in a very accusatory way. He says to him, why aren't you doing anything about it? And so that's a very dangerous place to be for anybody. We find that in the book of Jeremiah. And we also look at it in other books of the Bible. But God's response to him is very simple. God says to him, don't worry, I do care. And I will take care of this. Before long, God gives him the news that he doesn't want to hear. And that is the Babylonians will come and he will punish a righteous people. We can find that Habakkuk also is confused. Because how would God use an unrighteous, vicious nation to actually discipline his children? And there again, he's confused because he says, really, don't you care about your people? And the resounding comment always is, I do care. I really care. And that answers a fundamental question for you and I when we are struggling with something very difficult in our walk with God, and circumstance turns against us in a way where we say, this just can't be true. Circumstance can tend to distort our reality. In chapter 2, however, we find that when God sees sin in the world, he does not ignore it. It might seem for a moment that God tends to ignore what is happening, and you find that there is no consequences to what is happening. But God's words teaches us all the more than what goes around comes around. He says also, if you dance the dance, you will pay the piper. You reap what you sow. And so sooner or later, you might feel that you've gotten away with it, but there will be a moment when the chickens will come home to roost. You see, sometimes we think that we can do what we like, treat people the way that we want to, say things about them that we like, and we think that God does not hear. You see, when these people speak to God, James tells us that the Lord of Sabaoth will respond and he will resist. In chapter 2, we also see that God says that the Babylonians are coming. But I want you to watch that in chapter 3, God speaks to Habakkuk in a very strange way. And here is where the turn in the entire narrative takes an incredible turn. It changes not the circumstances that Habakkuk has to face or the people of Israel, but something changes inside the heart of Habakkuk. You see, brethren, here, I want you to look through this narrow lens of chapter 3, that sometimes we do struggle with God. God uses an unconventional way to resolve what is happening around us. But the third point in this chapter is that God does not change the circumstances, but he changes you. In this particular text, we start to see that the transition takes a very, very interesting turn. Something changed Habakkuk. Something changed him fundamentally in his locus, that he looked at things very differently. I want to look at three things that helped him grow from confusion, worry, fear to faith, to confidence, and then to joy. An ever-increasing escalation of this man's relationship with God. I remember going through something as difficult as this many years ago, and I can remember it, and when I study it, it makes perfect sense. What are the three things that Habakkuk did? The first thing that he did in response to this was that we need to remember what God has done. Verse 1 and 2 of Habakkuk chapter 3, this is the prayer of Habakkuk the prophet. Lord, I have heard the news about you. I'm amazed of what you have done. Lord, do great things once again in our time. Make these things happen again in our days. Habakkuk starts out and he says, God, you have a reputation that precedes you. We've heard about all your miracles. If we look through the eyes of history, and especially of our people, we know that you've got a track record second to none. We've heard about your glory. We remember about all the great things that you have done. And basically saying, Lord, please do it again. And if I'm honest with you this morning, I would imagine that you can remember a lot of things that God has done for you. I've got a little journal which I try to keep up to date. When I remember traumatic events that really was difficult and where people put you in a corner that you feel is impossible to get through. And you write down and you say, Lord, here's where I'm at. This is what I'm facing. I'm obedient to you, but I find this is very difficult. And in a remarkable way, God comes through. And maybe not for you, but for someone else. You see, the more Habakkuk knows about the planner, the more you can trust his plans. We referenced Romans chapter 8:28 yesterday, which speaks about the idea that God works all things for good. Here we find the same sentiments being almost illustrated in the life of God's people and written countless times through the history of Israel. Habakkuk in verse 3 says, I see God moving across the deserts from Edom, the Holy One coming from Mount Paran. His brilliant splendor fills the heavens, and the earth is filled with his praise. In these passages that I'm going to read to you, I want you to listen carefully, because you ask the question, what should I recount to God in my memory? Well, sometimes you can look at a subjective account of what you've experienced. But many times it is helpful to see God's track record within the people of God. Habakkuk chapter 3 from verse 7 to 15. It says the following. He says, I saw the tents of Cushan in distress, the dwellings of Midian in anguish. Were you angry with the rivers, Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the sea when you rode your horses and your chariots to victory? You uncovered your bow and called for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. Torrents of water swept by. The deep roared and lifted its waves on high. Sun and moon stood still in the heavens at the glint of your flying arrows, at the lightning of your flashing spear. In wrath you strove through the earth, and in anger you threshed the nations. You came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. You crushed the leader of the land of wickedness. You stripped him from head to foot. With his own spear you pierced his head. And when his warriors stormed out to scatter us, gloating as though about to devour the wretched ones who were in hiding, you trampled the sea with your horses, churning the great rivers. Habakkuk is telling God, I remember when you guided your people with fire and by the cloud. I remember when you fed us with bread. I remember, Father, when you parted the waters and we walked through. I remember when you shook the earth and the walls came tumbling down. I remember when you used torrential rain to defeat the enemy. I remember when you used pestilence and plague. I remember and I know what you are capable of. You see, brethren, when you are confused and you're struggling to try to make head or foot about God, you've got to look at his history. If you want to evaluate somebody that is unchanged in their behavior, unrepentant, or somebody who is consistent, you have to look at their past behavior, because it's an incredible predictor of how they will act in the future. And in the same way, God is at work. And then one of the comments he makes is very powerful, where he says, God, I remember your glory for your deeds and your power. I know you've done it before, and I believe you can do it again. The first thing then for you and I to almost transition and make that leap is to first and foremost remember what God has done. Acquaint yourself with the history of the Bible. Read the Word of God. Understand that this is recorded for your and my learning. It's written for a specific reason with a specific historical context, but it has eternal significance. In the second place, accept what God is doing. And here again, I would almost say, surrender to God where you are currently. Surrender, not just giving up on the circumstance around you or saying, laat God's water oor God's akker. But what you are saying is, Lord, I surrender by definition to your will. I surrender, Father, that in what I'm seeing and hearing from you is that my idea of salvation is different to yours. And so I don't quite understand how it's going to play out. But I've got a feeling after reading your word that you always work it out for good. And so I'm going to trust you. We see that reflected in the life of Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where he refers to his trials and tribulations as a thorn in the flesh. And he pleads with God 3 times, please, Lord, help us, help me. But all the time when he pleads to God, God says to him, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made known in weakness. And so we start to realize that there is great power, there's great significance of our vulnerabilities where we are currently. There is great significance when you surrender to God and you surrender to the fact that the God that you love will be the one to bring you through this difficult time. What Paul also learned through this is that there is something about being content. One of the key things are that maybe you are in a situation at the moment where you're really battling. You're trying to figure out how this thing's going to play out, and you're not very happy with how it is and where it is. God is saying to you at this time that you are in the moment where you are learning to be content. 2 Corinthians 12:10, for the sake of Christ, I am content with weaknesses, with insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong. This particular chapter speaks of 2 dimensions. The one dimension is God, to whom you submit. The second dimension in verse 10 is for the sake of Christ. You see, sometimes when you're a malcontent, you will criticize, complain, and moan and groan all the time. And God will have to take you through the trial, kicking and screaming. But something about contentment is different. When you start to look at your life and say, Here, ek is ver genoeg. Here, ek weet dat U in beheer is van my lewe. Ek weet, Here, dat dit nie ideaal is op hierdie oomblik nie. Maar wat ek weet is dat U alles ten goeie uitwerk. You see, Habakkuk responds And then he says, after hearing about the Babylonians, he said, Lord, I hear these things and my body trembles. My lips tremble when I hear these things. When I hear the sound of their hooves of the horses, my bones feel weak and my legs shake. Yet I will sit quietly and wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. In other words, it makes me sick to my stomach, Lord, just to know that here's an impending doom. Something is coming that is very difficult. But Lord, I accept what you are doing. Why? Because I don't see the bigger picture. Sometimes things happen in our lives, and maybe it's happening currently. But one time when you look at it, you understand that there are things that are too big for you at this time. And then you can do one of two things. You can accept the circumstance and bow to that one who is the perpetrator, or you can bow to the God who will take you through it. There was a wonderful elder who spoke to me, and he's passed on to be with God. He said to me, God will never bring you to it unless he intends to bring you through it. And so as you approach this thing, you surrender unto God. The third aspect that made Habakkuk transition from doom, gloom, and worry to joy and peace and contentment with God is that he trusted God, what he was going to do in the future. He says, I don't understand what you're going to do, God, but I'll wait patiently for the day of disaster that'll come. You see, he accepts his situation. The Babylonians had a reputation that preceded him. Everybody knew who these people were. They were not a nation to play with. Their violence was something that was unparalleled. But Habakkuk says, no matter how things will go in my life, even if I lose everything I own, God, I will still trust you. And I will still serve you because I believe that in the end, you will make everything work out for good. When you read the book of Job, you pick up a similar pattern. Because inside the book of Job, you start to see the initial shock at what has happened. You watch how various answers are suggested as to why God has responded the way that he does. But we also see that there is a moment in his life that's pivotal, that says, Lord, only you can control this. I want you to look at the society. It's an agricultural society. If you run out of figs, olives, grapes, grain, sheep, and cattle, you're in a lot of trouble. I remember one of the things as a child, my grandfather used to constantly, what he used to do is, he used to dry figs. He used to dry grapes as raisins. And one of the things my grandfather always did, and he would tell my grandmother, I was very young at the time, he would say to her, Mama, ons het hom nog droë vye. Ons sal goed wees. He would say to us, het genoeg reseentjies om ons sterk te hou. You see, there's times in our life when things become so incredibly difficult. What if you lose your job? What if you can't pay your bills? What if the doctor says to you, this is terminal? What if your spouse has a heart attack and you're left alone? What if your house burns down and everything in it and you're not covered by insurance? What then? What is your response going to be? What are you going to do? Scream and shout, rant and rave? What are you going to do? You see, and here's where Habakkuk says, I want to think of the ultimate condition because there is impending doom and it's real as the sun comes up. But what he's saying is, Lord, you can take care of me. I don't doubt for a moment that you're in control. And here again we see that many Christians have shown us in their lives that this is true. You may not have enough money. You may not be able to fill your life with lots of material blessings. But what he says in all of this, that sometimes the fig tree doesn't bud. Sometimes there are no grapes on the vine. Sometimes the olive crop fails. Sometimes the fields produce no food. Sometimes there are no sheep in the pen. Sometimes there are no cattle in the stalls. What do you do then? Do you become angry at God? Do you start throwing stones, protesting in the streets, and feel that the government should take care of us? Or do you choose to follow God anyway? Habakkuk's answer is simple. I will wait patiently for you. In you I will rejoice. In you I will place my faith. And I pray that every single one of us will have that kind of faith. Romans chapter 1:16, I want you to hear that echoing. That says that I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it's the power of God unto salvation. For the Jew first, and then for the Gentile. For in it the power of God. And then he says this most important thing, for the just will live by faith. When you move from a carnal life, when you move from a life of self-sufficiency, where it's ek, and I will determine my future, to where you surrender your will to God and say, Father, I know that you will help me. God will help you invariably through these three phases. The kind of question that you will ask in chapter 1, the kind of waiting that you'll need to do in chapter 2, and many times in the life of Christians here, and I'm sure when we sit down and have a cup of coffee, you'll be able to retrace for me years and years of your life that God has come through. Trusting in a savings account is just not enough. Because even banks can be robbed, currency can drop to nothing. And we've seen it in history, in the Bible, where people start to eat a donkey's head because they can't even afford to buy food. Habakkuk chapter 3 verse 19 says, the Lord is my strength. He makes me like a deer that will not stumble, so I can walk on the steep mountains. I love watching documentaries. Documentaries for me is the best way, not of escape, but of enhancing my view of life. You watch these incredible ibis as they walk up those steep cliffs. There was one picture I remember of the Aswan Dam where this particular ibis was against this rock, and the cameraman literally zooms in on the hoof of that animal. And all that holds him between dying is literally the corner of his hoof, but he holds on to it. And while I was watching this documentary, I asked the question, why would you do that? And the answer in the documentary says, because right through the walls of the Aswan Dam, you find that there's salt coming through, and they want that life-giving salt that they need for their survival. And when I read this text, I recognized that God keeps us in the times of impossibility, and that the Lord is our strength, and God gives us that we do not slip. The Lord is my strength. He makes me like a deer, and I will not stumble. You see, sometimes as the book comes to a close, nothing has changed on the outside in the circumstances of Habakkuk. The doom hasn't arrived yet, but it was close. But what he found was, although he was changed, everybody around him hasn't changed yet. They are still as evil as they were, but there was a shift in the heart of Habakkuk. In Isaiah 55 verse 9, you see God's ways are not man's ways. In the same way, you will find that in your transition and your grappling with God, you would shift. But the very people who inflicts the pain on you or hurt you doesn't shift. But you see, that is not your problem. You see, when you look at what Habakkuk is struggling with, he understands one thing, that there is God's reign supreme that will change this world the way he wants it to be. Corrie ten Boom made a quote, never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. Get to know God. Get to understand him. And I was writing to Laura during their time in Oman, when they were struggling and they were worried about getting out of Abu Dhabi. And she says, we got out just in time. We got out just in time. In those uncertain moments, last Sunday's lesson, they listened to twice because it was concurrent with what they were experiencing. You see, brethren, God's word is so accurate that regardless of time, we will find that God will find you in your journey and he will answer you in your moment. You see, sometimes we are tempted to raise same questions. Why do the righteous suffer? There's a lot of times we don't understand God. As long as we can remember that God is in control. And the hardest thing is to wait on God to fix everything. Psalms 27:14 says, wait on the Lord, be of good courage, and he shall strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. Be patient. What do you do like Habakkuk? Find yourself waiting on God. You see, maybe at the moment you're waiting for a new future. You're waiting for a new job. Do you go? Do you stay? You pray for wisdom, but the answers doesn't come quickly enough. What do you do when you find yourself waiting on God? Remember what we spoke about last week is that even though the waiter will be there to wait on you, they still serve. You still serve God. There are people waiting for God to restore relationships. There are people waiting on God to restore what's been stolen from them. But you see, there comes a time when you need to step into that third space and say, you know what, Lord, I know that you'll work it out for good, regardless of how this thing swings. And maybe sometimes the terrible decision or the best decision you need to make is to forgive. Let that person go. Forgive. You might be carrying a terrible grudge and the only person that's hurting is you. You see, bitterness is like you're trying to drink poison hoping it will affect the person who's caused you to be bitter. But at the end of the day, you need to understand that you've got a choice. The choice takes you through the cross, where the choice is, I'm going to trust God, that even if God exacts punishment on whoever it might be, I will never rejoice. Because the God that I serve is a scary God, and he always exacts punishment. You see, 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 12, there's a beautiful song that we sing that says, I know not what of good or ill may be reserved for me, of weary days or golden days, before his face I see. It's a song we sing out of that text. But I know whom I have believed, and I'm persuaded that he is able to keep which I've committed unto him against that day. I don't know how this is going to work, but I know who I trust. And I love the way it ends. That's the message that comes from Habakkuk. I love this text. I've heard my grandmother quote this. And she says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flocks be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. You see, sometimes we do not know what our future holds, but we know who holds the future. And so this morning I want to encourage you. Now here's the kicker. If you're not a child of God this morning, you are selling yourself short. And do you know how you're selling yourself short? Because all you can do is hope and deal with that which is visible. Do you know how limiting that is? You are completely and utterly surrendered out to the forces of this world. There is no eternal dimension or spiritual dimension. But I can see a God who's reaching out to you and say, hey, I'm right here. You don't have to do it alone. You don't have to be on your own. Like Habakkuk made that transition, saw the eternal God, surrendered his life to him, and said, Father, regardless of my circumstance, I will trust you and in you will be my joy. If you need to obey Christ this morning, and maybe you need to give your life to God, or maybe just even ask for prayers, I pray that you'll do so as we stand and sing our song of encouragement. Let's stand and sing together.